Hello and welcome to AXSChat. Today I'm very happy to welcome Alastair Campbell from Nomensa. Alastair is someone that I've admired for a long time and have worked with on a number of projects in the W3C. Alastair does an awful lot of work, far more than I do, making sure that everything is understandable and is doing a lot of the heavy lifting on helping the Cognitive Accessibility Task Force with some of the work that they're doing, as well as all of the main stuff on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines Working Group. So great to have you with us today. Also mention Nomensa is a digital agency that I have a lot of respect for. It's done some great work on sort of usability, but your focus has primarily been sort of accessibility, and it's one of the few digital agencies in the UK that has a really a well-deserved reputation for this. So welcome, Alastair. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here. So I guess, yeah, where would you like to start?
Well,
It's a great introduction.
Well, how did you get into accessibility in the first place? What was it that triggered your interest?
Well, I'd started working in digital in a particularly fabulous time, which was 99-2000, when the dot-com crash happened. And the company I was working in kind of nosedived at the time. I'd started off essentially as a usability consultant, so I was doing usability testing, that sort of thing. And on our very first project, well, it was for a college in the UK, and they said, we've got this new legislation coming in 2001. We need you to make this virtual learning environment accessible. And I had no idea what that meant at the time, but I was in charge of the front-end code, so I had to go off and investigate. And that was when I sort of dived into, accessibility standards, so WCAG 1 at the time, and CSS and HTML, and sort of looked at all these standards and went, oh, this is fabulous, everything's here. And then I tried to use them. And at the time, I was working in Internet Explorer 5 and Netscape and things, so doing CSS layout was a nightmare. But I sort of persevered, and we, as I said, I was sort of, even though I was from a usability background, we just started off as a company of 4 people, started Nomensa, and this was our first project. And it was my responsibility to do that deep dive and work out what accessibility meant. It was from that very first project, and then a little while after that, we were sort of pioneering CSS layouts and things back before they were, really done properly. Well, really done in for sort of mainstream websites. And ever since then, I've been doing a mix of, information architecture, usability, testing, which turned into user experience work when that term was coined. And then sort of, I'd say around 2008-ish, I started getting involved with more W3C things. When WCAG 2 came out, I was looking in from the outside, just looking at the drafts that were coming out and popping comments in and seeing what happened. And then a little while later, Nomensa joined W3C as a company. And I think my first area of interest was the authoring tool guidelines. So I was obviously very familiar with WCAG 2, and we were doing accessibility audits for clients, doing accessibility testing with people with disabilities. And then, sort of 2010-ish, I joined the authoring tools accessibility guidelines working group, which was an even bigger mouthful. It was getting into the W3C processes, joining meetings, all that sort of stuff. And then, ever since then is probably the stuff you're a bit more aware of in terms of authoring tools guidelines were published. So I joined the main accessibility guidelines working group.
Yeah.
Little whirlwind tour of my accessibility and W3C background.
And it's interesting because the last couple of weeks we have had guests on, and the topics have been around authoring tools. Because we had Mike Gifford on, who's doing a lot of work for Drupal and their accessibility, and then last week we were talking about virtual learning environments. So it's kind of serendipitous that we've got you on to tie the two together now. So I'm very much a big fan of stuff that's usable and simple to use. Maybe because I'm a bit simple, but essentially. There aren't many organizations that do user experience and accessibility. We tend to have that sort of separation and segmentation. What is it that, you know, why do you think that is? And how do you think we can bring the two together? Because clearly there's a benefit for having a joined up approach.
Yeah. It kind of comes down to how you fit the tools into the process. So I tend to see making things easy to use is a process where user-centered design is the whole sort of industry approach to doing that, and that's good and useful. But it does tend to sort of optimize for either the majority. I almost think of it as like a sort of normal distribution, and you want to optimize this thing based on task rather than people. Usually, it's based on, I remember doing usability work in terms of, buying boilers, for example. So we're sitting people down in front of a website, trying to get them to buy a boiler, seeing where they went wrong, and you tend to be able to optimize for the task. So user-centered design approaches and processes work really well for that. And where I see sort of the need for thinking about accessibility is making sure that in terms of the interface and the content understandability, that you're flattening out that kind of normal distribution. You're trying to make sure it works for everyone, and you can still optimize for the domain, for the task. But I do see sort of accessibility as you then need to make sure you are thinking through all these other sort of niche cases. So, it's where the guidelines come in. They're quite good for thinking through alt text structure, lots of the interface elements. And I think the sort of one of the interesting areas of work at the moment is that crossover of how do we also get people to think through the sort of different cognitive sort of abilities and aspects that are less obvious, frankly, because a lot of the interface aspects are quite concrete, and you can demonstrate, you can show how a screen reader works, you can show how Zoom works, how contrast impacts people, keyboard accessibility, that sort of thing. But I think we're still kind of in the early phases of this crossover between user-centered design and then expanding that out to how people with different cognitive abilities tackle things.
It certainly feels like. Go for it, Deborah.
I'm joining from Costa Rica. Yeah, I'm joining from Costa Rica. So we had Neil's request, put a flower in the hair. So, but Alastair, welcome to the program. David Perez on my team, my chief strategy officer, is getting married. So we have come to Costa Rica to see the wedded bliss. But I want to ask you, you have already started talking about this, Alastair, but on AXSChat, we've had people very openly criticize W3C standards. And by the way, not just W3C, but all standards, saying that standards aren't good. They stop us from being innovative. They stop us from being creative, and they get in the way. We all don't agree with that, only because at some point I have to know the framework of what you're trying to get me to do. How do I begin to do that if I don't have standards? But I was just wondering if you wouldn't mind, taking, exploring that topic a little bit. I mean, do we need standards? Do they get in the way? Do they make us less innovative and creative? I don't think that they do, but I just wanted to turn the floor over to you.
Sure. Well, Let's consider the goal. The goal is making, websites and digital products accessible to as many people as possible. So if we start off with that goal, do the standards hinder innovation? Well, the way they're created, and it's been a sort of topic I've been talking about a lot in terms of WCAG 2.1 was published not that long ago. I've been trying to sort of promote how I see people should use standards like WCAG in their work. And they should really be considered a baseline. It's not the be-all and end-all of accessibility, but actually, if you're not meeting sort of WCAG 2.1, or at least you've been through and you've visited, if you have issues that are caught by WCAG 2.1, you then sort of need to make an assessment of this is a barrier for someone. We know it's a barrier because these guidelines come from testing with people. They come from experts who watch people with disabilities interacting with digital products. So we are very confident that they, where things are caught by the guidelines, that they do represent a barrier. Where things get a little bit more complicated is how big an issue is that barrier. So, my go-to example would be if you have missing alt text on the next button in a process, that is a critical barrier. If you have missing alt text on one of the partner links in the footer of a website, it's a kind of tree falling in the woods scenario. It might be the case that nobody ever notices. So the assessment of how critical a barrier something is, I think is there for discussion, and that's something an organization needs to think about. But actually the process for creating the standards, and Neil will be very aware of this, is very conservative in terms of what gets in. So the working group is made up of a lot of different people. So the working group working on WCAG 2.1, we've got people from companies like Nomensa who are sort of accessibility specialists. We've got people working for larger organizations, Adobe, Microsoft, those sorts of people. And, they're very much coming from the point of view of how feasible is this thing? So, we added a new color contrast guideline, and it was complicated. We had to go through lots of different scenarios, and even since publishing, there's still discussions going on as to, how do we apply this in a way that benefits users and is feasible to do for organizations that are large and small. And a lot of guidelines that were proposed as part of the 2.1 process didn't make it in. That's some people will point to that as a problem because it's not meeting user needs. Some people will say, thank goodness, because, we've increased the standard by 30% almost. So there's, there are more things to check than there were before. But all of them do represent user needs in some form. So, yeah. And in terms of innovation, they're also written in such a way that they don't say how you should achieve them. They kind of say what you should achieve, and there are techniques and recommendations for how to achieve them. But they really don't change. They really don't say you have to do it like this. And actually, some people complain about that as well. It would be easier to understand if they were completely directive and say you have to do it like this. That would be much easier to understand. But if we did that, then I think we would be, held up as saying, you're stifling innovation. You're saying we have to design in a certain way. We have to do these things. And for any of the guidelines which do impact on the design, we have some to do with, width of columns and that sort of thing. They tend to go down at the sort of AAA level. So, that doesn't tend to be mandated by governments and things. And that, that is kind of the balance we have to, or the line that we have to walk, is not stifling innovation whilst trying to have guidelines for things that we know are or of benefit.
Great answer.
Thank you.
I know it is a tricky line, because a lot of the stuff that we identified as user needs for cognitive is really tricky to find ways of implementing in ways that are also testable. Because I think that's the other thing that is a big part of the WCAG guidelines, is that it needs to be something that you can prove, especially when people are taking into account that this is now covered and absorbed into legislation as well, and then becomes rather than a guideline issue, it's a compliance issue. There is this nervousness on the part of large organisations, well, large and small, that if they can't test and prove that they've met this, then they're going to be open to litigation and opening themselves up to risk. So I totally understand the two sides of the argument, but I agree, it doesn't, the way that it's written, despite sometimes the complexities of the language and the complexities of the process, is not intended to suppress innovation. Yeah, it's there to act as a foundation, although the process of getting there is sometimes tough.
Yeah, and in terms of foundation, it's I think, as I said in the beginning, it's sort of using the right tools for the job, and where the guidelines are really helpful is making sure you've thought all of these different sort of niche situations through, and you've sort of planned them in. I always tell people you need to be sort of looking at the guidelines, understanding them, and then actually acting on them as early as you can, which is usually, as soon as you've visualized an interface, even on paper, most of the guidelines, you can then either think about how it's going to be assessed, or you can define how it's going to work. So, for example, with UX designers, I'll go through and say, right, how are you going to structure your sketch? So people have sketched out an interface, could be on a whiteboard, on a bit of paper. It's like, okay, so, what's the heading one? What's the keyboard order? If you start building those things in right from the beginning, it's a very smooth process after that. It's when people use the guidelines as a checklist at the end that it feels horrendous as a process, as a thing that you have to do. Because all those decisions have already been made. It's too late. So in that scenario, you're creating lots of extra work. But also going on that sort of aspect of organisations, large and small. One of a client we've had was a physics journal. So many of the sort of language aspects, they really struggled with for that, because they have such a unique audience, and because the guidelines are used by governments and they sort of set those as a standard everyone has to meet, one of the criteria for any new guideline is that you have to be able to apply it to any website. And because we can't use words like appropriate in this sort of standard that's used for legal purposes, it makes it really difficult. That we really have to narrow the scope on what the guidelines are actually sort of trying to achieve. And that's not to say they're not useful. It's very good for thinking through all these different situations. But I always recommend, apply your user-centered design process as well as this, so that you're getting that sort of both sides of it. You're getting the usability, the UX, you're optimizing for the task, and you're not forgetting the sort of different kinds of interface that people can use.
Well, I have two questions. The first is, how can we somehow find a way that people look at accessibility as something creative and that enables people? A little bit away from all the guidelines and rules, how we can make this more attractive. And the other is, where you see innovation on accessibility coming from today.
Yeah, it's they're kind of two sides of the same coin, aren't they? And it's actually getting easier to talk about these things now, thanks to a lot of the work some of the bigger companies are doing, like Apple and Microsoft. So things like Siri, I believe, was based on them having bought a particular company, possibly Nuance, I forget the names, which was created for people with mobility issues and RSI and those sorts of things. So a lot of the work that people do to make something input agnostic or kind of multimodal in terms of visual and audio, anything which is really adaptive is going to find mainstream uses. We're seeing all sorts of voice interfaces come around now. So a lot of the long term, coming from academia, coming from disability organizations, a lot of the interfaces created are now becoming mainstream interfaces for particular uses. And I think, I suspect everyone has seen Microsoft's, inclusive design toolkit, which goes through the permanent, temporary, situational disabilities. So the, a lot of the sort of mainstream interesting interfaces these days are based on things created for people with disabilities. So there's a very easy line to draw in between innovation and accessibility, and it's becoming really highlighted by things like Xbox accessible controller went almost immediately into the Victoria and Albert Museum in London as a design thing. So again, it's very easy to sort of draw that, but I don't know, when talking to clients, sort of national level organizations and that sort of thing, that's the aspirational side. But there's also the general robustness principle is kind of like my favorite argument when I'm talking to designers and developers is if you consider accessibility, your digital thing is going to work in more places than it would otherwise. It means you're not just sort of designing for yourself, you're designing for a wide range of usage, and more people will use your thing, whatever it is.
I think I definitely want to echo what you were saying about the innovation that's coming from the large companies. I was lucky enough to go to Future Decoded last week, which is Microsoft's big thing in the UK. They had Satya Nadella come on stage, and first words out of his mouth were talking about diversity in tech, closed his speech with a bunch of videos around the assistive tech that they're putting into Windows and Office 365, and on comes Jenny Leigh Flurry to talk about accessibility, followed by another keynote speaker all about disability confidence. So the three keynote speeches at the top Microsoft conference of the year in Europe, all on accessibility of innovation. Of course, they're putting the Microsoft AI angle on it, but fantastic. What a great message right from the top. And I think that this is really, clearly showing the overlap between the utility that people with disabilities get from having the assistive tech, but also the crossover, like you say, with all of the voice interfaces, etc. Antonio, you had a comment.
Because organizations like Microsoft, others, have a certain size, and they have people all over the world. And sometimes, if you don't have people who manage the organization from a leadership point of view, coming up and talking about this at the major events, it's quite difficult to pass that message to everyone. There's going to be somewhere, or a developer somewhere at Microsoft that was, I never heard about that. So it's very important to have that message coming right from the top.
Absolutely. I think it's quite hard to miss these days, because there's so much messaging coming out. It's very positive, and it's a good thing to see.
Yeah, they must see it as a competitive advantage, otherwise this wouldn't be happening.
No, of course, but and it's something that I'm also used to position my own organisation as as one of the areas where we think differently. As a large IT integrator, there aren't many that have the kind of focus that we do on accessibility, that run things like apprenticeships and contribute to all of this kind of stuff, because generally it's in the weeds. But actually, if you think about it, we touch millions of users. You know, even in the mundane stuff where we're delivering people's sort of daily desktop computing experience, you can make that a lot better by understanding the accessibility tools that are built into Windows and all of the other assistive technologies that people use, and having a plan on how to deploy that, manage it, and all the rest of it that can make a significant difference to people's lives. So again, as some of this stuff becomes more and more embedded, it's going to be something that more and more people use, because actually it just makes life easier. You know, it's not,
Yeah.
I'm using this because it's specialist tech.
And I can't, I can't even count the number of times I've gone and done accessibility training in an organization, and tried to get people to open up, just basic tools like a magnifier on their laptops, and their infrastructure provider, I'm sure not yours, has stopped them from, opening up a magnifier or changing the accessibility settings, and then you sort of take people through that on another laptop, and they're like, this is great. I want to change my default zoom on my browser and those sorts of things. I've done accessibility testing where a lady with Parkinson's disease was, we had recruited because of her mobility impairments, but she was looking through the sort of visual help for changing browser settings, and was like, oh, this is great, I'm going to use this. And I think, just as, if we've got that sort of inspirational messaging at one end, I think more people become aware, and those simple things at an organizational level and a personal level suddenly become a lot easier.
Yeah. No, I think that's true, and there has been this tendency to lock everything down, and some of that's an education process, because people are obviously security conscious, but we need to educate people that actually, you don't need to lock down accessibility tools. They're understood, you manage them right, and they're useful. They help productivity of the overall organisation. It's been great chatting with you, Alastair. We're at the end of our half hour. I need to thank our friends at MyClearText again for doing a great job with our captioning, and also Barclays Access for continuing to support us as we approach our 4th birthday. It's been a long and enjoyable journey. So thank you very much, and we look forward to you joining us on Twitter.
That would be great.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alastair.
Me.
Our pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye.